Welcome to Caribbean Rhythms with Bronze Age Pervert. I have listened to you and your complaints regarding my voice and delivery. I believe your complaints, the few of you who have said so, are entirely xenophobic and based on the fact that I am Russian and you are anti-Russian. If I had come here and spoken with a Bakongo accent or something like this, you wouldn't dare to complain. But because I speak like a Russian man, you say I must change my accent. Well, I listen to my audience, and I have started to take crystal therapy, speech therapy classes, and slowly I hope to improve my accent and my delivery for you. Meanwhile, I had on my mind Angola. Why I talk this? You know, from my travel, I know such useful information. Like, for example, where in Lisbon you can buy a map of Angola. Well, it's in one of the downtown subway stations where gentlemen from Angola used to congregate in bowels of the city like bushmeat hawkers in Kinshasa markets. They come there in groups along with Moroccan hash dealers and also a deformed man with elephantitis, whose visage still horrifies me after many years. I wrote a letter of protest to the city for allowing this on the street. Allowing this is cruelty to that poor man and also to passers-by. Why am I telling you this? Because in this show, I was going to talk about Angola, and you may fairly ask, Bap, why do you waste our time on one of the holes of this world? Why not talk, I don't know, Ficino's Resurrection of Platonism, or discuss Stephen Runciman's book, The Last Byzantine Renaissance? And no, I am not just being a snob dropping obscure names. I mean to discuss precisely these and such things on future shows is very important for my message to you. But what are such things made by dead old white males, they say, compared to the iPhone, also designed by white males, but now with some subcontinental contribution? But isn't this what we are told, that the iPhone is a greater achievement than medieval cathedrals? And if that is so, why not also Rwanda? Yes, Rwanda, the capital of Angola. Did you know it's the most expensive city in the world? But that must surely mean, if you ask Cato Institute, or maybe the propaganda martinets of the Koch brothers, that must mean Rwanda must be one of heights of history, given that it is the most expensive city during, obviously, the greatest time ever for mankind. Well, I will explain how this all came to be. And you will also see why shithole like Angola is more relevant to your life today than you imagine, more relevant than you would like. But given that this has been a very high energy week full of chaos in the news, let me address first some recent happenings. I loathe to treat on this show weekly news outrages that others can do for you. It seems we have overload of such on Twitter or elsewhere, and I wanted this show to be about historical or scientific matters of interest. Other topics no one else but me could touch. But the Epstein case is different. Epstein is almost surely a cat's paw for someone or something else, but for who? It's impossible for outsiders to know with any certainty, and even when you do know some connections, like, for example, that Lucky Luciano, the famous mobster, that he was associated with the CIA, that's not the end of the story. He was also associated with others, maybe more important. And Robert Maxwell, the father of Ghislaine Maxwell, who is Epstein's procuress and sidekick, he's well known to have been associated with the Mossad, and many of Epstein's other connections seem to point in that direction as well. But even if this were so, it wouldn't be the end of the story. There are others higher up the food chain he could still have been working for on the side. These things are not centralized. Think instead a feudal system with overlapping allegiances and sovereignties. This is what happens when you don't have transparent government. No one knows who really runs America. During Obama years, if you believe Hillary Clinton in a clown pantsuit was running foreign policy, you're crazy. And like I say in my book, you don't know their names and their intentions are obscure. Usually, you can bet on power and money and the accumulation of more as motivations, but again, that's not the end of the story. Could it be a Masonic offshoot, the Rosicrucians, an Ismaili sect, a radical Jewish Frankist sect, or the Carpocratians, or the Cathars, others still slinking among us, wielding power? Who knows? It could even be something much more pedestrian and of more recent and artificial vintage. At the member level, in any case, at the schmuck Clinton level, it's just pathetic people hungry to feel important and full of uncontrollable vices. The underworld, in any case, is from where this Babylon, the modern world, gets all of its energy. It is its hidden structure, the underworld, since at least 1950, and probably for longer. We live in a mob-based gangster regime. They use words like liberal democracy, human rights, and examples of lurid atrocities, the Holocaust and other genocides. They use these like a short skirt to cover up their nakedness, but at times a strong wind comes and the tranny bulge underneath appears and shocks the people. But then things go back to normal. They know the people are easily distracted. If I tell you in the book that you must form your own mafias, all legally, of course, and using the utmost cunning, but legally form your own mafias, you must listen. Because the last entity capable, maybe, of openly breaking loose from this mafia network was Germany in World War I. And if it had triumphed in World War I, then there would have been for the world a shining example of Hellenic culture and freedom to stand against the hidden tyranny, against this smothering modern mediocrity. I believe all the propaganda we hear since, for a long time, but they say since 1800 the world has made amazing progress because of liberal democracy. I think that's total garbage. Liberal democracy is gangster rule. And make no mistake, despite America's relative health and freedom before the Civil War, the open frontier, that was entirely and only the cause of this freedom. But despite that, people like Schopenhauer, Stendhal, many others, even then rightly recognized America as a gangster regime. And that is what every country has become that has adopted the liberal democracy system. It's not the same as capitalism. I believe in national capitalism under authoritarian leader with transparent and responsible and accountable rule. That's not what liberal democracy is. There's nothing else that a modern so-called parliamentary democracy can be other than gangster rule. It will inevitably be corrupted by international finance and by hidden hands that guide the state for profit. And the consequences of this for culture, for cultivation of the quality of the human animal are very bad. Nietzsche explains why in detail. We can talk another time, but do you actually need a history or a proof? You can just look out on the street. If you walk on the streets of the Qua, today in America, where this disease is most advanced, the people have been reduced to an army of the deformed. It used to be that in blue cities, the girls were thin, for example. But in the last 10 years, that's all over with. The Brooklyn and Manhattan girls are themselves quite porky now, on average. Well, and what do you make of this? I mean to say, until somehow this underworld breaks up of its own, you will only be able to achieve any true power on the course of nations by learning from Epstein, yes, or rather learning from his handlers. You have to be willing to become like them. And this is why I was so disappointed to learn of Roux, Darius Roux, the famous blogger. I like him, but his change of heart. I was disappointed to learn because, how do I put this? Far be it for me to tell any of you how to not live virtuous lives. And if he's sincere, and if you live in this new religious way that he says now, that life that he will now live will be better for him as a man, as an individual, but it's also somewhat selfish. We need men like Epstein and his masters on our side, men acquainted with the darkest holes of this Babylon if we're going to win. We need them more than good and virtuous men right now. I'm sorry, we need scoundrels, capable scoundrels far more. Speaking of scoundrels, have you ever heard of Paul Roux? He could have been one such man, a hero of our time. If he had not been involved in the opiate crisis in America, I would even call him a hero after a kind, and why not? We can look past that. He represents a true image of freedom and power in our world. Paul Roux. Look up the book The Mastermind about him. A frog friend you all know about, a very skilled visual artist, told me about Roux recently. Paul Roux is a Rhodesian man who became a computer programmer. He designed an encryption program, E4M. Maybe some of you have heard of this. In his youth, he was very taken, it seems, with a computer game of Wing Commander, which I also played obsessively. You fight, I think, feline furries, something like this. XCOM was another favorite of mine. That being the alien who made the zombies frightened me the most. But Paul Roux was, in other words, a computer autist in his youth, like many of us. Terminal autism. But he didn't use his Neanderthal brain profits merely to enjoy himself or to get overpriced slut wife. Or ugly wife like Facebook or what's his name, Bill Gates, that Microsoft guy. Look at his wife. No, Paul Roux used the gains from his programming work to expand in all kinds of dubiously legal and later illegal activity. A hero. One of his main actions was the online prescriptions market. But being inspired by success here, he began to get into arms dealing, drug trafficking, logging, mining, smuggling of gold, precious metals, and so on and so on. In other words, he went straight for what I tell you are the sinews of this dark world we live in. He knew where the joints of the skeleton were and went for them. His activities in Africa, in the Congo, were especially significant in logging and precious metals. Of course, he had, like many billionaires, various private intelligence and liquidation squads working for him. And these smoked his opponents, smoked them. And any who made themselves a nuisance got rolled over, maybe sometimes without his knowledge. It's entirely possible Epstein was cat's paw for such an interest or such a cartel. something perhaps more secret and more capable than Paul Roux. Because as a lone artist, as a lone wolf artist, despite his impressive skills and ambitions, Paul Roux didn't make it. He got on wrong foot, on wrong side of bigger fish, and ended up getting arrested. He's now awaiting trial or has become an informant or something like this for America. It's not important. He's in jail. But his instincts, if not his execution, were right. He knew Africa is the new promised land, the eternal weakness of that continent, plus its natural wealth. This makes adventurous men salivate. See, for example, Mark Thatcher, Margaret Thatcher's son, who was arrested also in Zimbabwe, I think, for plotting to overthrow the government of Equatorial Guinea, a major oil producer. Only a few years ago this happened. I mentioned in my book men like Bob Denard and Mike Hoare, who went to seek their fortunes in Africa. They attempted island coup in the Comoros or Seychelles, island recently in news. They were also catspaw, by the way, at times for various intelligence services of France and so forth, but again, is not the end of the story. That's not all they were. I will tell you in more detail later about men of power. But don't believe necessarily the stories about African demographics. As my good friend Loki Julianus points out, a lot of these are calculated by, for example, locals estimating how many people go to a local watering hole, a well, and telling this to census takers. So much of modern demographics and therefore demographic projections are false bullshit, and so you shouldn't blackpill about it. Gabon, another major oil producer, has one of the lowest population densities in the world, even according to official figures. Sure, if you go there, you might get cryptid insectoid that will enter your ear canal and eat out your brain, as has happened from time to time to European explorers. But in the end, Africa can be a new frontier. As the central Babylon weakens, Africa the new frontier. Opportunities will open for men of power. In any case, this brings me to Angola. What is Angola? Well, it's a piece of land, at least. Beyond this, it can only be one thing: Portugal. Angola has no history and no existence aside from Portugal, but this goes for almost all nations colonized by Europeans, at least in Africa, almost. Otherwise, it's a mishmash of competing Bantu tribes who themselves stole the land, if you want to put it that way, from the Khoisan tribes that originally inhabited the land. In West Africa, the Bantu, as you know, sometimes like to eat pygmies, believing it will bring good luck or cure for disease. This is influence of the French Enlightenment on West Africa, at least. Look up also penis disappearance hysteria scares in the Sudan. It's great fun. Anyway, Angola, it's a land exceptionally rich in diamonds and oil. By the way, this is why it's so expensive right now after the civil war is over. If you work in oil and you go to Rwanda as the agent of a Western oil company, the local bureaucracy will charge you, for example, $70,000 to buy a fridge. The locals still live in poverty, of course, in slums, but the elite takes its cut. Your company has to pay for this. Sounds outrageous, but I think it's a rather straightforward way of taking a cut. It's more or less honest. It's just legal bribery or extortion. In America, similar things take place in 1,000 ways and affect the average citizen, not the businessman or the oil executive. This is why you have to pay over $100 a night for a hotel even in the middle of nowhere in the Kwa, whereas in supposedly most expensive Tokyo, you can get a decent room for $60 a night in downtown. And Alex, the train master, he has other special knowledge. Even for less you can get. You can sleep in gaming room for much less than that. Try that in New York. Because America is made for shearing dumb sheep like us. You can get international cell plan in Europe. You get minutes anywhere in the world for something around $10 a month. But it's many times that in America and doesn't even work, and so on and so on, so forth and so forth, because it's like Angola in the USA as well, but just a little bit more cleaned up, more formalized, and most important, you are used to it. So anyway, after the Portuguese left Angola, and it was granted its independence, it didn't win its independence. It didn't win an independence war with Portugal. It's just the Portuguese commie pinkos granted it. There was something, you see, called the Carnation Revolution in Portugal in 1975, in which essentially Marxist military officers, supported by various other pinkos, think of Elizabeth Warren or David Axelrod in uniform, they took over the country and decided unilaterally to end Portugal's 500-year-old empire. After this, Angola became independent, you could say, except it didn't really. It led to a civil war that didn't end until the 2000s, and that from, you just look at the timeline, this civil war has basically defined the existence of Angola as a country. Angola without Portugal, a state of permanent tribal war for power and for spoils, in which foreigners heavily meddled, like in other made-up countries where these civil wars happen, like in Syria or more recently in Africa. If you look in the Congo, did you know about the war in the Congo after Mobutu in Zaire and how many have died there, yet it's almost never on the news? Well, like in these countries, there were very many factions fighting to get control of the state and much foreign collusion. Everyone wanted a peace. I wonder why there was no Black Sun esoteric Hitlerist group fighting in Syria, by the way. But maybe there was. I heard rumors of such last time I was in Latakia anyway. But the Soviet Union supported the Angolan faction called the MPLA. You don't need to remember all these names, but that's the faction or the party that still controls Angola now. They won out in the end, the Soviet-controlled faction. Now, what's interesting about this faction is how it supported itself, how it justified itself ideologically. This party, the MPLA, and their Soviet sponsors, excuse me, they keep attacking me with radio waves every show. You must forgive me. But this party, the MPLA, went out of their way to paint their rivals as tribalist, as racist, whereas the MPLA was to be the internationalist, non-parochial party, the ethnically tolerant party, and therefore the one most suited to rule all of Angola in the name of the country as a whole. Does this sound familiar? Of course, this was only for appearances. The largest base of this party was the so-called Kimbundu tribe, so it was itself a tribal party. But there was a grain of truth to what they claimed. This truth was because Angola's mestized population, its mulattoes, and its European population also supported this MPLA party that ruled in the name of internationalism, cosmopolitanism, you see. But here's the interesting part. These populations only amounted to about 3% of Angolans. So when you think about it, you could say this public relations move to present yourself as internationalist and your opponents as ethnic nationalists and racists. This is a cynical maneuver for power, which indeed it is if we take a somewhat closer look. But I hope you see the relevance of this political problem and why I'm talking about the Third World during the Cold War. Because much of what the Soviets did during that struggle remains with us. Unfortunately, it's quite relevant. It remains so. Please Excuse me for a moment, I'll be right back. My ceremonial hot cocoa is ready. I must make an offering and a sacrifice. Be right back. Yes, it took my maid a long time to open condensed milk. Are you a fan of this? It's affected many cuisines throughout the world. American rations left over condensed milk, however, one of my favorite treats. But the Portuguese, who were supplanted essentially by the Soviets in this struggle for Angola, the Portuguese had laid the ground for such a policy of fake internationalism, you could say. Very relevant for our understanding of multicultural or multiracial society. Different European nations ran their colonies in different ways. The English attempted in some way to settle the land or to bring their constitutional system to places they colonized, to train the natives for self-government. Very naive, like always, the Anglo. They had, however, some success. If you look at Barbados today or Botswana, they ran relatively well. You see, this was the attitude even of Ian Smith, the president of Rhodesia, towards the local black population. He was a hero, in my opinion. We call them naive, but it's not entirely an impossible course of action. The Belgians, by contrast, were the most autistic of the colonial rulers. They wanted to build good trains, good hospitals, good infrastructure, and cared nothing for the natives otherwise. They treated them like machines. The French tried to get local elites, the very vain French, they tried to get local elites to look up to French culture and to the metropolis to work their ambitions. I talk another time in detail about this, the French vanity about their culture, but it's a well-placed vanity. And another peculiarity, you know, Gobineau, the founder, so-called, of racism, the steampunk father of racism, saw the Russians as half-yellow apes and incredibly ugly, but he loved mulattas, I think. Like so many of the French, he found Africa and mulattas entrancing, and so has some surprisingly nice things to say about them. The French have always hated the Russians and loved the blacks, so it is. The Portuguese, however, the oldest colonialists, and also the ones from a very small country with very small populations, they had to be creative, and they had the most devious and science fiction-like policy of all. They promoted something called, eventually, racial democracy, but in their actions and their rhetoric, even before then, it was called miscegenation. Yes, miscegenation as a political program. Now, why would they do this? Is it, as white nationalists and even anti-white racists claim, because they hated the white race and wanted to mix it out of existence? No, it was very cynical. In Cape Verde, for example, one of the first Portuguese colonies, they shipped slaves from Africa there. They bred with them to form a mulatto population that henceforth would serve as middlemen, as managers of the colonies and also of the slave trade. They were always few in number, no more than a few percentage points of the population. But they were always the best agents of colonialism, the best managers for obvious reasons. The best middlemen. The Portuguese themselves stayed relatively unmixed, mostly, and unmixed Portuguese families, along with other European hangers-on, continued to form the upper class in the colonies, whereas the mulattoes formed a kind of middle class, together with others. But the rhetoric was that we are all mixed, we are all equals, and that the Portuguese, therefore, must be exceptionally kind, internationalist, universalist colonists, a tropical people, don't you know? And the mulatto population was as well as the Portuguese stated policy of miscegenation, and no doubt the cultural fetish that came along with this that was quite sincere for mulatta queens. This was all real, and it was all to be the visible proof of Portuguese imperial clemency and magnanimity. In fact, as you can see, it was a Machiavellian and cunning means of colonial control. Don't take just my word for it. Amilcar Cabral was the first, you could say he led the first Marxist guerrilla movement in Africa, the leader of the anti-colonialist Marxist movement in the Portuguese colony Guinea-Bissau. He recognized all this that I'm saying right now. It's very easy to see through it. It's in his manifesto. He calls this generous Portuguese policy of miscegenation to be a devious imperial plot, which it is. Blacks with self-respect, in any case, always see through it, and black nationalists, like Malcolm X, wanted black self-determination and nothing to do with the white liberals' white supremacism, which is, after all, what I'm trying to explain for you here. Because this system of so-called miscegenation, multiculturalism, and internationalism is just thinly veiled white supremacism. Self-respecting black nationalists want no piece of it. Hard to believe they could fall for voting for a faker high yellow like Obama. Or maybe it's not so hard to believe, since people have such a hunger for respect they'll take any crumbs or fakery plastic thrown at them. But otherwise, very dark-skinned blacks, real American blacks of slave stock, for example, Clarence Thomas, that's inconceivable right now, I think, as president of America, and everyone knows it. And if you see them in the hood, for example, even they know on a level that the high yellow butlers like Obama and Kamala Harris aren't them. They are different. They say they half-breed. They half-breed. They know this is white supremacy, and that these are the middle managers of white liberal supremacy, just like in Portuguese colonies. What of it then? Does this program of white supremacy through cynical, limited miscegenation and fake internationalism, does it have a future? I doubt it. It has no future even in the former colonies of the Portuguese, because in the long run, racial mobilization comes anyway, and the squatters come. And soon enough, you have Nairobi-sized slums on the edge of town, and squatters will take all your large farms. They will take latifundia. The rich, and it is absolutely the white rich who promote this in America and around the world, including, of course, a certain element of the rich who have been incorporated within the WASP upper class, of course. The Jews, as we know, who bring to it an undubitable element of racial or ethnic competition or hatred. We talk another time of that. But overall, it is absolutely the white rich who are promoting this insane system of racial mixing and fake internationalism. But they see at most a few years into the future and care nothing for 20 or 30, let alone 50 years ahead. So they're exceptionally poor stewards of civilization. They care nothing of it. They care only of their own families, they think. And even there, they have short sight, myopia. The Portuguese also had, by the way, in their colonies, hundreds of years of practice of playing divide and conquer with racial minorities. But the American whites, including the very tiny upper class pushing this scheme have no such experience. And given how things are in America right now, it will be hard for whites to play divide and conquer. Remember, it was always in some way the left that did all this. This goes very well with a leftist ideology, but now the left, they're finding themselves, the white left, the Baizu, they're finding themselves kicked out of their own parties and organizations. Well, very good then, but the ethnically balkanized world that's coming will be very unpleasant, and the only solution, as I keep saying, will be military dictatorship, will happen long before any secession movements, I believe. Because in this weakness of tribe fighting tribe comes the ancient enemy, Asia, embodied in China. This has parallel in Angola as well, and I will close on that. China's involvement in Africa is far older than people realize. It started soon after their cultural revolution in the 1960s, and Maoism saw itself as the vanguard of a colored third world uprising against white civilization. It's been attempting to organize and rile up Africa against Europe and the West for a long time now. In Angola, it supported first a party called the FNLA, and then finally the main antagonist in the Angolan Civil War called UNITA. Strange bedfellows. South Africa, also supported this party. And by the way, South Africa was hardly a friend of Rhodesia after independence. We talk another time, but things are not what you'd expect. China supported UNITA because it wanted to oppose the Soviets in Africa and wanted to get a piece of the spoils as the Europeans were leaving. The history of UNITA and its leader, Savimbi, is quite interesting. Manafort, I think, actually lobbied for Savimbi for a while. That's the leader of one of the factions involved in the civil war in Angola. America also supported UNITA. Anyway, UNITA ended up losing in the long run in Angola, but elsewhere China has been very destructive of civilization in Africa, or whatever was left of it. Ian Smith, the leader of Rhodesia, said more than once that his principal antagonist, this was in the 1970s, that his principal antagonist was China, not the Soviet Union. China was the main funder of the African insurgency against English Rhodesia. And by the way, just so you know, in South Africa, the main funder of the Communist Black Party, besides the Soviet Union, was Sweden, oh yes. But China, the principal antagonist of civilization, of white civilization everywhere in the world, and many other such cases as well, all over the African continent. Steve Saylor likes to say that Los Angeles is such a nice piece of real estate. If the Anglo is stupid enough to abandon it, it's not going, in any case, it's not going to return to the Indio bred by the ancient Central American palace theocracies to be a corn farmer. It's not going to the Mexican Indio. Enterprising peoples like the Azeris, the Chechens, the Armenians, and the Uzbeks will just take over that area. Or as you see, the Chinese. They see Africa, a plump chicken, and are salivating over it. Men of adventures in the West see the same. And the question is, if we can be unleashed soon enough to embark again on a time of conquest and high piracy, or if we'll still be in a straitjacket while our demented elites turn Berlin and Paris into the shanty towns of Kinshasa and Nairobi, while China takes over the actual Africa. Some population transfer, yes? But I would like another kind of population transfer. A modest proposal. Can I make it? Can we please just sell all the college-educated, why-not, spinsters and harridan derangeoids to Africa right now? Can we sell Elizabeth Warren to African men in Africa and all the why-nots in America? Just sell them all. Population transfer. We'll take the mulattas in exchange and the Lebanese cuties from Nigeria. Thank you very much. Say hello to Nicholas Nassim Taleb for me. Say hello to Weihan Zhang for me.